3 years after the assassination of Libya's Colonel Gaddafi by a mob, we take a look back at a terror attack the British and American governments blamed on Libya, and hear from the father of one of the passengers that perished over Lockerbie. And joining me on the line now is Flora Swire's father. That's Jim Swire. Hi, Jim, and welcome to the Politics Show.
Thank you for inviting me.
First of all, Jim, what are your thoughts about the most recent developments with Libya? Because we've been discussing over the last few weeks how actually it looks like quite a lot of the case against Colonel Gaddafi was confected. What are your thoughts about all that?
If you're talking about the case for Gaddafi over Lockerbie, yes, there wasn't a case. I don't think Libya was involved. But in terms of Libya herself, of course, I think she's very sadly becoming another failed state.
Back to 1988 and the Lockerbie accident. What was the cause of it, in your view? Because many people said that this bomb had come on the plane from Libya. What has since transpired that you've discovered that it wasn't quite as we were told?
It wasn't quite. The major thing, really, was the trial in Holland, which I went into believing, of course, that the two accused were guilty, as I'd been told they were. But I emerged from the trial, and I subsequently discovered a number of other people did likewise, satisfied that those two men were nothing to do with it. I don't have any information as to whether the upper echelons like Gaddafi himself were involved, but I don't have any positive information at all that they were. But I'm entirely satisfied that the two men accused were not involved in any way, that the bomb was not put on board originally at Malta, didn't come through Frankfurt Airport, was put on board at Heathrow, and your listeners might be interested to know that the Metropolitan Police examined the situation at Heathrow after Lockerbie and discovered that Heathrow had been broken into airside 16 hours before the Lockerbie disaster, and that the airport, although told by its night watchman that the break-in had occurred, decided to do nothing about it.
Do you mean people actually sort of got in through the fence and actually got to where the runway?
Yeah, they broke, those heavy rubber doors, swing doors that they have in some points in airports. There was a pair of those doors closed with a heavy padlock, and during the small hours of the morning before Lockerbie, somebody broke through the padlock and the doors, disappeared into airside, and the airport decided they were going to assume that someone had broken out of airside, not in, which was a quite extraordinary thing for them to decide. But the thing you have to realise is that the entire information about the break-in was suppressed until after the trial of the two Libyans. So the court knew nothing about it, and the defence of the Libyans, who were trying to prove that somebody else had been responsible, not the two Libyans from Malta, were denied that information until the verdict had been brought in of guilty. Now, that wasn't a fair trial, and the UN observer at the time said this didn't represent justice. It was a political show trial, and the effect of the trial was beneficial to those of us who seek the truth, because we learned so many things that were not true, like the idea that the bomb had come with a long-running timer all the way from Malta.
Also, what about warnings? Because I understand that it's always easy to look back with hindsight and say there were warnings, but there weren't just warnings. There were certain people that actually were booked onto that flight that then decided they weren't going to travel, when in fact it was only two-thirds full, I believe.
That's correct. It's only two-thirds full, and after Lockerbie, within the next year or 18 months, President Bush held an inquiry into Lockerbie, and that denied that there was more than one cancellation. And this in the face of the fact that on the U.S. Notice boards in their Moscow embassy, for instance, a notice had been put up saying there were threats to Pan Am. This was before Lockerbie had happened. There were threats to Pan Am, and if anybody from the embassy wanted to travel home for Christmas, they were free to book on a different airline if they were worried. So really, this coupled with the fact that the Bush Commission of Inquiry came to tell us in Britain what the findings were, and we went to talk to them in the U.S. Embassy in Grosvenor Square in London, and one of the members of the commission pulled aside one of the UK relatives during the meeting, and you won't believe what he said to them. What he said to this guy, he said, Mr. Cabman, your government and mine know exactly what happened at Lockerbie, but they're never going to tell.
Well, that's pretty chilling, isn't it?
It's chilling, all right.
Tell us some of the things that you've discovered, Jim, over the years then, that have made you question this official story and start to put the case together about what really happened to your daughter.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two things one can most easily pick on. One is the break-in to Heathrow, because we learnt at the trial that there were specialised bombs available to terrorists in 1988, which worked in a particular way. They were made in Damascus by a group who were closely allied to the Iranians, and the Iranians, 6 months before Lockerbie, had an Airbus shot down by an American missile cruiser in the Gulf, and had sworn they would get their own revenge for it.
Well, that's the fascinating thing, because I can remember when it first happened, it was one of the first things that was said, is that this is a revenge attack by a Middle Eastern country, possibly Syria or Iran. There was no mention of Libya at all.
Yeah, that's correct, and there wasn't until the investigation had proceeded for about a year or so. But the fascinating thing about the particular bombs that were available to terrorists in 88 was that, first of all, they were made by a group that was affiliated to Iran, although they were working in Syria, and their bombs are very special. They had an air pressure switch in, which kept them totally switched off unless they sensed the drop in pressure. You know the sort of thing when your ears pop when the plane goes up towards cruising altitude, your ears pop because the pressure in the fuselage drops. And these bombs detected that. And what we were told by a senior, this is in court in Zeist, what we were told was that these bombs, the air pressure switch took about 7 minutes to switch on. And what it switched on was a kind of timer called an ice cube timer, which were very crude and had no adjustments at all, and were made in such a way they would run for around about 30 minutes. So it would have taken such a device approximately 7 minutes plus approximately 30 minutes before the bomb would go off, provided the bomb was put on board at the airport of origin of the target flight. The Lockerbie plane flew for 38 minutes. I mean, as an American attorney might say, I rest my case. And it was one of those devices, I'm sure, that was put on board at Heathrow Airport. And I'm sure there were very potent reasons why the break-in at Heathrow was suppressed, thereby wrecking the objectivity of the trial that those two poor Libyans were submitted to.
Now, you've actually met the Libyans, I believe. Can you just tell us what happened when you met them, the people who were accused of the Lockerbie bombing, and what you made of them?
Yeah, the start of it all was that as soon as the indictments against the two Libyans were issued, I went to see Colonel Gaddafi to beseech him to allow the two to be tried. Now, I was very keen that they shouldn't be tried in America, because I thought that if they were, they would be found guilty whether they were guilty or not, and they would be executed, and I don't believe in capital punishment. So I said, together with Professor Robert Black, who's a very senior lawyer from Scotland, we decided the best thing to go for was a neutral country trial, which is what eventually happened, and much to the consternation of everyone except those who were running the prosecution in the court, what came out there showed that the two Libyans were not guilty as tried. But we were trying to persuade Gaddafi to do that. But in terms of the Libyans, one of whom was found guilty, I got to know him really quite well before he died. And I went to see him a few months before he finally died. And even then, although he was in great pain and knew his death was close to hand, he was beseeching me to continue to try to clear him and his family's name of involvement in the Lockerbie disaster. The accusations against him horrified him, because he was in fact not even a senior member of the Libyan intelligence as suggested by the court. And he was very keen that his family's name should be cleared, even if he'd left the planet by the time it became possible. So the situation we're at now is that we have referred the case back to the Scottish Criminal Case Review Commission, and I have trust in them that they will do a fair job of looking at the evidence that we now have, and recommend that there be a further appeal against the verdict. And if you want to hear the other thing that's really devastating about this that we've found out since the trial ended, is that there was one key piece of forensic information, which was a tiny piece of circuit board. And we have now discovered that the way this tiny piece of circuit board was made, which appeared to show that a long-running timer, which could have come from Libya and from Malta, could have been used, was in fact manufactured by a different technology than the ones used in the timers which Libya possessed, in such a way that the metallic plating on the fragment shown in court turns out to have been done in a way that wasn't in use in industry until several years after Lockerbie had happened. Now that is tantamount to a realization that somebody with access to the Scottish Police evidential material had manufactured something after Lockerbie with the express intention of perverting the course of justice, because apart from some very shaky evidence from the island of Malta, there was nothing other than this forensic fragment of circuit board that appeared to confirm the idea that the bomb might have come from Malta.
So what's your impression then of the diplomatic service, the Foreign Office, the State Department, and the courts and the justice system, and also, of course, the TV and the media in the way that they've dealt with this case?
Well, I would never have believed what I know now before Lockerbie. I was a very ordinary run-of-the-mill GP in central England, and I believed that the country was run by people that we elected, who did their best to run the country properly, including, according to citizens, their due rights under European Court of Human Rights legislation. But I now discovered that the governments of Britain and America, between them, conspired to ensure that a completely wrong story was presented in court. I don't understand how the judges who tried it were able to reach the conclusion they reached, but I think the right way to go now is to have a properly convened further appeal to overturn the verdict, because it's very clear to us that the people in Whitehall, for instance, are still taking active measures to ensure that the truth does not come out. A recent book which revealed the truth about this fragment, together with independent scientific confirmation of the evidence that it couldn't have existed in 1988, Downing Street issued a statement on the morning that book was published, saying the book was an insult to the relatives. Now, this indicates that they had taken the trouble to get hold of the files somehow on this book before it was published in order to look at it. And in saying what they said, they were saying something that would be very welcome to many American relatives, most of whom, for one reason or another, have accepted that they were told the truth in the trial, which clearly we now know they can't have been, because this fragment could not have existed at the time of Lockerbie. It's an extraordinary story, isn't it?
It is. Well, Whitehall, one can understand. I mean, we've got the child sexual abuse Whitehall cover-up ongoing right now. One can understand possibly a cover-up there. Also, you've indicated possibly the judges involved in a cover-up. But surely, even if these two parts of the case, the whole Lockerbie incident, were cover-ups, surely our TV journalists, our radio journalists, our newspaper journalists would be there to expose it and get to the bottom of it.
I have to correct you one thing. I haven't said that the judges were part of a cover-up. All I'm saying is that I can't understand how they reached the verdict that they did on the basis of evidence they've heard. But sorry to put you up on that, but reverting to the media, I think 25 years is just too long for the media to maintain interest in one story. There was intense media interest at the beginning, quite a lot of media interest up until the end of the trial. But when I came out of the trial, they were all saying things to me like, isn't it marvellous, they've got one of the bastards who killed your daughter. And I was sitting there slightly stunned, saying, hang on a minute, what about this, what about that, doesn't fit. I don't think this trial was done right. And it wasn't until a little bit after that hullabaloo of choruses about isn't this good news that I discovered some of the heavyweights who agreed that this trial was a complete nonsense and wasn't in fact representing justice at all. And of course one of the things the trial did was to drive a coach and horses through the good name of Scottish justice. And we have to get this sorted out, because I think it's so terribly wrong, so evil, that a country like Scotland should have its criminal law system perverted by politics, because it's very clear that American politics, as you've studied the film The Maltese Double Cross, American politics were what lay behind having to find an alternative explanation to the obvious one, which was that Iran was behind this. And I know that the Iranians paid significant money to the group in Syria who made this particular type of bomb that I tried to describe to your listeners.
Now, yes, you mentioned the documentary, Alan Frankovich's documentary, The Maltese Double Cross. It's quite long. I think it's 2.5 hours or something. But I was quite shocked when I looked into it to discover that this wasn't actually made by any of our television companies. The money for that documentary was put up by the entrepreneur Tony Rowland.
It was indeed. And I was very grateful indeed to him for doing that. I have to say now that I don't think that dear old Alan Frankovich, who's also died, of course, since this was made, I don't think he quite got it right. I don't think that a passenger who had come from Lebanon brought the bomb unknowingly in his suitcase onto the plane. I think that the bomb was brought into the airport at Heathrow and was in its own suitcase.
Well, that's right, because quite a lot has transpired since that. I mean, he got the film out pretty quickly after, obviously much, much longer has gone since then, and things have come out since. But anyway, let's have a listen now to a clip from The Maltese Double Cross, filmed by Alan Frankovich, which actually was a bit of a tussle to even get shown on British television. I think it was eventually shown on Channel 4, wasn't it?
It was Channel 4, and to originally have it shown, we had to get Tam Diel to show it in the House of Commons because there was a prohibition on showing it initially. The government did not want this film shown.
And what about in the United States? Was it shown there?
No. The only place it was shown was in the House of Commons, and one freelance cinema in Glasgow showed it, but that cinema was broken into the night before in an obvious search for the DVDs of the film, and subsequent to the showing, there was an attempt at arson.
Goodness me. Anyway, let's have a listen now to a clip from that film, the Alan Frankovich film, The Maltese Double Cross. And we're going to hear a guy called Oswald Lewinter, who was a supposed CIA agent, and his job, apparently, was to leave a false drug trail to Libya. And one of his bosses telling him to do that was a chap called Oliver North.
Yes.
In 1984, I was undercover, and my base of operations was in Würzburg at the headquarters of the 3rd Infantry Division, and I was contacted by a fellow who worked for Oliver North. I was asked to develop an operation laying a trail which would lead back to Libya and make it look as though a Libyan effort was behind this to bring drugs into the United States. The way to do this is to make it look as though the material had been shipped from Europe to Libya and then from Libya to the United States. I was buying a precursor for the manufacture of speed and methylbenzyl ketone, which has the same chemical formula as cinnamic acid, which is something harmless that they put into toothpaste as flavoring. I'd buy that, and the labels would be switched, and the cinnamic acid would be shipped to Libya. Methylbenzyl ketone would be shipped into the United States to the mafia who were paying for it in advance. My instructions were to use Frankfurt, since that was where all the contacts were. I was told to play the role of Mohammed El-Hwama, who was a low-level operative in the Libyan service, and if a purchase order or something were needed, I had been provided from headquarters with stationery. I have a sample of the stationery. This is the bill of lading. Libyan Airlines was to be used, and this is the bill of lading for Libyan Airlines, showing that this material is going to Libya. I received, for instance, the funds to do this through the military banking system. This one in Würzburg is a voucher for the receipt of 317,100 German marks. The street value of the drugs that I imported was about $350 million.
Now, Jim Swire, the father of the daughter, Flora Swire, who died in the Lockerbie crash. Jim, what do you make of the drug connection here? Because there apparently, it seems that there may have been a drug run regularly used by somebody on this route that your daughter, the plane that your daughter was flying on.
I think that what Dr. Lewinter says is entirely credible. I think that there were arrangements for importation of drugs on that route, and this was what the Maltese double-cross film majored on. I don't think that's actually how Lockerbie was done, but I do know somebody else, like De Winter, who is a chap called Dr. Bill Chasey, who took an American congressman to meet the two accused Libyans after the indictment had been issued. And when he got back to the United States, he found all his bank accounts and things had been frozen. And the CIA actually came to him and said they wanted him to take them back to Libya in order to meet the two accused because they wished to eradicate them, in other words, assassinate them. And he refused. And so they made up a false case against this poor guy, Dr. Chasey, and imprisoned him. And they came to him in prison and said, look, if you do what we ask now, we'll spring you from prison today. You'll have no criminal record, and you'll take us to meet these two men. And he still refused, and he served his time in prison and is now running a major charity in Poland as it happened, but that's not relevant to this story. But there are others, too, who have been seriously disadvantaged by attempting to blow the whistle on how Lockerbie really happened.
Amazing, Jim.
You wouldn't believe it, would you?
You wouldn't, but let's have a listen now again to a shorter clip from Alan Frankovich's film, and this time where a local radio reporter describes the drugs actually being found in the fields around Lockerbie.
And just asking around people who've been involved in the investigation afterwards and involved removing the bodies from the hillside, they were able to tell me specific passengers and what they had on them. And one officer also told me how he had to get a farmer passing with a tractor and trailer to help him take a suitcase full of what he presumed to be heroin away from Tundergarth and down to the Dextar factory where the luggage was being stored once it was recovered from the area around.
And Jim, what about Pan Am? Because it seems that the Pan Am is kind of defunct. Do you think that the whole controversy surrounding Lockerbie, the lies, the cover-ups, that sort of thing, were part of the reason that Pan Am went down?
Oh, I think they were a major part of it, yes. I think what you just let us hear is the voice of a chap called Dr. David Fieldhouse, who helped the police search the site. And amongst other things, one of the bodies that he found was never reported in the official list of people who've been killed. So there may have been 271 people killed, not 270. But the whole thing is surrounded by so many mysteries of these kinds that it's very difficult to get to the bottom of any of it. But Alan Frankovich, who did the Maltese Double Cross, was a very penetrating guy. And when I got to know him well, I arranged by a face-to-face meeting to send him a fax. We were using faxes in those days. And I said, Alan, I'll send you a fax saying that I'm going to speak at such and such a meeting in London, and we'll see what happens. So he said, OK. I sent him the fax, which he received, but that evening, the Evening Standard in London published a report that I was going to speak at the meeting, which was totally false, but it indicated that even in the early days, our communications were being interfered with as well.
Also, what do you think it's taught you? You're trying to bring together some of the evidence that you've accumulated over the years. What do you think ultimately was really behind the Pan Am 103 crash?
I think it's fairly straightforward. The Iranians lost 290 people to a US missile fired in the Gulf. They swore they'd get their revenge. People in the aviation industry tell me it would take them 5 or 6 months to do so, which of course was the gap till Lockerbie happened. And I think that the Iranians paid considerable money to the group in Damascus in order to provide one of these specialized bombs which could be got on board a plane and would always explode about 35 to 40 minutes after takeoff if you could just get access to the luggage compartments of the plane at the airport of origin. And access was obtained, I think, by means of the break-in at Heathrow. And one of the things that keeps me boiling with rage is the fact that nobody really who matters has acknowledged that Heathrow, which had been privatised by the Conservative government not long before, in fact failed to carry its duty out, which would have been minimum duty, having found a major break-in into airside, would have been to suspend all outgoing flights until they found out who'd broken in and why. And they didn't do that. They shirked it, and they have never paid any penalty for that. And I think that the failure to bring that into the public domain gives far too free a hand for slipshod security at Heathrow and other airports to this day.
And what advice, finally, would you have for people who are seeing terror attacks around, as someone that's actually experienced this kind of thing yourself, about how to read it, how to, if possible, penetrate what really happened?
It's very, very difficult. Call me defeatist if you like, but I feel one can't penetrate the inner echelons of the security services. I got as far as talking to one CIA guy who did tell me about the money that Iran had paid to the Syrian group. I also got as far as knowing that a chap called Vincent Canestraro had been put in charge of accumulating evidence against Gaddafi by President Reagan. And that particular individual American was also transferred and put in charge of the investigation into Lockerbie, although his background was to denigrate Libya with or without valid evidence against Libya. So there was a long ongoing American use for piling blame on Libya rather than anywhere else. And in terms of Iran, of course, there were oil interests, and there was the question of American hostages to be freed. You know, the first hostages were freed within a few days of the indictments being issued against Libya instead of against Iran. And one of the first two freed was Terry Waite, who's now signed up to a petition we also have running in Scotland for a full inquiry into all this.
And where do we go from here then?
Oh, well, we're trying to use the Scottish criminal justice system through a further appeal. Rather curiously, we find ourselves fighting to clear the name of the Libyan, Basset Al-Megrahi, who died, who was found guilty, because that seems to be the way forward. At the moment, if we try to ask for an inquiry from anybody, they always say, oh, well, we got one of the bastards, didn't we look like guilty, they were brought in, etc. And if the Scots won't do it, then we'll have to go to the Supreme Court in London. If they won't do it, then we'll have to go to the European courts. But I think we have to try and use the justice system of these two countries of England and Scotland to bring this into the open. I have a horror at the very idea of going anywhere near the American justice system, which had offered, incidentally, the people who contributed to the finding of Megrahi being guilty. They contributed the information about him being the buyer of clothing that was found in the wreckage. But we also now know that they knew long before the trial that the American authorities, legal authorities, were offering between $1 and $4 million for anyone whose evidence would contribute to the conviction of the two accused men.
Well, quite a temptation. And I'm going to bring in old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers in here. Martin, this is a long-running case, the Lockerbie case. It seems there's still been no closure, certainly for Jim here. What are your thoughts about what you think may have been behind it?
Well, I hear what Jim's been saying about the Iranians, and of course, if it was the Iranians, it would have been to do with the shooting down of the Airbus. But of course, at that stage, Syria was being lined up to drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait.
Exactly.
And therefore, the Syrians, for geopolitical reasons, the Americans didn't want to have a row with the Syrians. But I must say, I don't quite buy into this, because if the bomb goes on in Heathrow, I would suggest that that's probably something possibly to do with the internal struggles within the Western security services. They're the kind of people who probably break into Heathrow. How are the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command going to break into Heathrow? Breaking into Damascus, maybe, but Heathrow? I suspect there's some kind of another level again.
I wonder what you make of that, Jim, if you think maybe there was some sort of tussle going on between different factions within the security services.
It's a very interesting suggestion, and the very fact that we were told that both governments knew exactly what happened, but they were never going to tell us. I mean, excuse me, we have a right to know who murdered our people, and we have a right to know why their lives were not protected. We have a right to know why no action was taken over the break-in at Heathrow, whether or not it was connected to Lockerbie. And if it is true that the break-in brought a device that somehow was connected with the Western security services, that only makes it even worse, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, well, the other point I'd make is that if there was a bomb which exploded on the plane, a circuit board would be vaporised. Anybody, provisional IRA activist or anybody would tell you that. The circuit board doesn't survive.
No, it doesn't.
And of course, what the McGrahy had to be released in the end. If you remember, Alex Salmond released him because he said he was dying and he had to do it, and there was a sort of confected row in the media about it. But as I understand it, he had to release him because a Scottish police inspector was going to testify at McGrahy's appeal exactly that the CIA had interfered with the crime scene. And of course at that point Alex Salmond has to send the Glasgow police to Langley, Virginia to interview people from the US with a view to having them extradited, etc.
Yeah, well, of course that immediately makes you think, well, will the Scottish government find some way to block a further appeal against the McGrahy verdict? And the chances are quite high, unfortunately, that they may, because some time ago, 18 months ago, the Scottish government arranged for a transfer of responsibilities in such a way that if the Scottish Criminal Case Review Commission, who are the people we've applied to for a further appeal, if they recommend a further appeal, the High Court in Edinburgh has now been given the power to reject the suggestions received from the Scottish Criminal Case Review Commission. So it looks as though it may be that the SCCRC will say, yes, there should be another appeal, and that then that result will be blocked by the High Court. And of course what you're dealing with is a very small clique of top law officers in Scotland, all of whom know each other, go out to dinner with each other, and it's very difficult to find a route that one can trust when one has seen the proceedings in a major international criminal court that we had at Zeist perverted for political reasons. Who can you trust? It's the old question, isn't it, that's summed up in the Latin phrase, quis custodiet ipsos custodienses, which, for those of your listeners who possibly may not speak Latin, means basically who guards the guardians? Who do you trust to deliver truth and justice at the top of the pile?
Point, I would say that your campaign over the years has been a beacon of light in a very dark world, and the Lockerbie incident, as we know, is not the only terrorist incident that the world's been plagued with over the last 20 or 30 years. But I think, we try and educate our audience on this show in particular to realise that everything is not what it seems, and you shouldn't just believe the first story you're told by Western intelligence services.
Yeah, and the thing that particularly disturbs me is the difficulty that there was in actually even getting this documentary broadcast. The fact that it's never broadcast in the United States is absolutely shocking, considering that, all the effort that's gone into actually putting all that information together for the public on such an important matter, and that so little has happened since to really get to the truth, apart from the campaigners, Jim, you and your colleagues. Well, anyway, Jim Swire, who lost his daughter Flora on the Lockerbie bombing in 1988, December, I think it was, 1988. Yeah. Thanks very much for joining us on The Politics Show. More power to your elbow, so bless you.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Made in Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.
Great to speak to Jim there, Martin, but there is still this lingering doubt, isn't there, this question over the possibility that there were a whole bunch of people, I know Susan Lindauer has written about this, various other people, that there was some kind of attempt by good people in the security services, maybe in the CIA, to possibly dob in some of the bad people, and that the bad people stayed on the ground, the good people were heading off to America, and they never made it.
Well, if people want to check out Susan Lindauer, and you could just do a Google search or any search engine and find her.
Who is she?
She's a former CIA agent, and she was actually involved in various things. But eventually, she was, basically persecuted and imprisoned in the US. But her line on all of this is that, in actual fact, the CIA are drug runners. We were talking about that in the first hour.
Yeah, we mentioned Oliver North.
Oliver North. Oliver North appeared in that. And Oliver North, of course, was definitely involved in bringing massive amounts of cocaine into the United States in order to create a slush fund to fund the CIA's various black activities.
But wasn't he actually convicted, Oliver North?
No, he wasn't convicted. There was a proper inquiry. John Kerry had an inquiry, and various journalists, Robert Parry and
This
Gary
is in
Webb,
the Iran-Contra.
The Iran-Contra affair, which is a bit of a misnomer, really, because the real scandal was not that they were swapping arms for hostages, it's they were flooding inner city US with crack cocaine in order to fund their activities. And I'm afraid that the CIA and the MI6 are their junior partners have a massive, overwhelming track record of being involved in drug running. And Susan Lindau's position on this, and I don't know whether it's true, but this is what she says, is that there was an element within the CIA that was involved in drug running. Some people were about flying back to the US to tell the FBI perhaps that the CIA were involved in drug running, but they never got there. And of course, if you're putting drugs on a plane with a nudge and a wink, then it's quite easy to put a bomb in when you put the drugs on. Now, I don't say that I know what happened, because I don't. But anybody who says that they do know what happened, and it was all the Libyans and everybody else, and that's what this is all about, clearly wrong. And of course, the bigger point is that the Western intelligence services are beyond the law. They are terrorists, they are drug runners, and ultimately the Scottish police, the Irish police, the British police, the Italian police have got to do the police's job, which is arrest the senior people in the intelligence services and put them on trial. And the other alternative, of course, is war. And that's
getting bigger by being better. The #1 choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.